Warm welcome to everyone to Deep Green Resistance, a discussion with Derrick Jensen. I'm Robbie Spence. I'm a member of the Green Party of England and Wales. I'm here with Emma, who used to be, and obviously with Derrick Jensen, who's from California. So Derrick's going to talk for a short while, and a lot of what he's saying is in his book. He's a co-author of the book called Deep Green Resistance, which is available on his website, free to download. Donations welcomed. And I'm just going to kick it off by reminding everybody what I wrote in the little blurb that I sent round. Great pleasure to introduce Derrick and his topic of deep green resistance. In a sane world where Derrick's values of biocentric environmentalism were more widely accepted by society, he would need no introduction. He'd be actually famous already. As it is, he's only famous in the world of radical green politics and philosophy. And he's the co-author of a couple of books, Deep Green Resistance and Bright Green Lies, and much more besides. We're going to be talking about issues that touch on core green values and philosophy, such as the question, do you think this culture will undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of life? So that's the starter question for you, Derrick. And I did also add my comment, prepare to be inspired or disillusioned. So I don't know whether you're going to inspire us with the answer to that question or disillusion us, but it's over to you now. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for organizing this, and I would like to thank everybody for showing up. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoy it. So yeah, when before I wrote my book Endgame, I used to give a lot of talks, and at the talks, I would ask people, do you believe the culture will undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? And of the thousands and thousands of people that I asked at the various talks, that question, nobody ever said, yes, we're going to have a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living. One guy at one of the talks raised his hand, and then everybody looked at him and he said, oh, voluntary. No, of course not. And then put his hand down. And the point is that we will be living sustainably someday, or we won't be living at all, by definition. And I would say if I had to sum up all of my books into one sentence, it would be this way of life won't last forever. And when it's done, I would prefer there's more of wild nature left rather than less. And I mean, for me, that's really the central question. Oh, and then the next question, if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, if you don't believe that and you care about life on the planet, what does that mean for your strategy and your tactics? And there, the answer is that we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because we don't talk about it. And the reason we don't talk about it is because we're also busy pretending that we have hope that this culture will undergo this voluntary transformation that I don't think is going to happen. And, every cell in my body wants for that to happen, but I just don't see it. All biological indicators are going the wrong way. I just saw an article a couple days ago about how Japan is currently experiencing 2 deaths for every birth. And I thought this was some of the best news that I'd heard in a long time. And the article, though, was framed in terms of this is a complete catastrophe. We can't collectively, well, there's a couple of problems. One of them is that we can't collectively move away from even something so simple as you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. I'll tell one more story and then we'll go to a question, which is I really became an environmentalist in 1967. That's when I was in second grade. 68, I mean. They put in a subdivision right next to where I lived. And before then, it had been, just these meadows and pastures. And I remember thinking in second grade, so if they keep doing this, where will all the cottonwoods go? And where will all the garter snakes go? And the anthills and the grasshoppers and the meadowlarks? And so I didn't have this language when I was 7, but I had the understanding that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And that's just absurd. And yet we have an entire way of life that's based on it. And I guess I'll go. I guess I was going to stop there, but I'll do a couple more stories. One of them is, I guess, three stories that might not seem like they're connected, but I hope are. One of them is that I have a doctor friend who says that correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment. And I think about that a lot and think about how we consistently are not making the correct diagnosis. We we think that if we can just get this one particular law passed, things will be okay. Or if we can just get a Democrat in the White House, things will be okay. Or we just think that um, tweaks here and there might solve the problems. But I'm going to lay out a pattern. And they say one sign of human sentience is the ability to recognize patterns. And I'm going to lay out a pattern here and let's see if we can recognize it in less than 6,000 years. And that is, when you think of Iraq, is the first thing you think of cedar forest so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. That's what it was prior to the beginnings of this culture. The first written myth of Western civilization is Gilgamesh deforesting the hills and valleys of Iraq. And when you think of the Arabian Peninsula, do you think of oak savanna? Oak savanna, they were all cut down. When you think of the Middle East, the Near East, do you think of uh, I'm sorry, cedar trees? Because we all heard the cedars of Lebanon. They still got one on their flag. Um, there was one of those ancient Greek philosophers, I think it was Plato, but I'm not sure, um, started complaining that deforestation was harming water quality in Greece. And I'm reasonably certain that the uh, Greek Department of Environmental Quality said we need to study this question for a few years to make sure there's a correlation. Um, North Africa was heavily forested. Those forests went down to uh, build the Egyptian and Phoenician navies. So the point is that there are certain ways of life that have destroyed the land base where they are, and they've done it functionally. Um, and so years ago, and this is really where I'll stop. Years ago, uh, I was riding in a car with a friend of mine, George Straffen. We were stuck in traffic. And I was just making conversation. I said, "So George, if you could live at any level of technology that you wanted, what would it be?" And George was not in a very good mood. And he said, "That's a really stupid question, Derrick. We can fantasize whatever we want, but there's only one level of technology that's ever been sustainable, and that's the Stone Age. And we will be there again someday. The only question is what's left of the world when we get there." And so to wrap all this up and then go to questions, it's I think it's really important to there are really we can sort of divide environmentalism into three parts or three different solution oriented people or groups. One of them would be shallow greens, and those are people who think that if you just tweak a few things, everything will be okay. And that's one approach. And by the way, when I talk about civilization being inherently unsustainable, I'm not saying we shouldn't work to make national parks. I'm not saying we shouldn't work to do individual things. We'll get to that later. The second group is called Bright Green, and they believe that technology will solve the problems created by technology. And they believe that if we can just power the economic system with a bit of solar and wind, and I'm being ironic with a bit because they're pushing this down our throats everywhere, a bit of solar and wind, then things will be okay. Um, just we can power the economic system differently. And then there's the deep green perspective, which really follows from the old deep ecological movement, which is that there are some fundamental problems in the way we look at the world and the way we interact with the world. And yes, we need to, it's all hands on deck. We need to protect whatever scraps of ground we can. We need to protect whatever wild places and beings we can. But the problems are on every level, from the sociological to the psychological to the epistemological, um, to the historical. And they're also functional to our way of life. And we need to address, be it, we need to seriously address those, some of these issues, and attempt to address them as, I guess here's the last thing. I've said last thing 5 times now. I guess this is the last thing for this part is we always pretend that we're so smart, and they call us Homo sapiens sapiens, and I always figured they added the second sapiens to make sure we got the joke. Um, but we call ourselves Homo sapiens, and I wish we used at least just a little bit of our intelligence to actually face the problems that we are not facing and that the world is enduring right now. Um, if the problems were just that we could try to find answers, that would be really fun. But the problems are far have far more momentum and are far more difficult than that. And I think they require some of the most intensive conversations that we as a people have ever had. It's only life on Earth that's at risk.
Thanks. Shall I come to you with some of the questions now then, Derek? You ready? Yeah.
Sure.
But I've just seen one that's come in right at the end, which says, "What, if anything, gives you hope?" So this is what my experience. I started reading Deep Green Resistance today. I haven't finished it, and at the one point in the even in the preface, you say something about love is what motivates yourself, and what you're hoping will motivate the people that come on board with what you're trying to do in terms of love for the planet that we have. So could you answer that question? What, if anything, gives you hope, and maybe expound on this sort of how love will do whatever, triumph, see us through, something like that.
Honestly, the despite the problems there, one of the things that gives me great hope is Chernobyl. And yes, I know there's terrible radiation. I'm not suggesting there's not, but the beavers are back, the wolves are back. And what this says to me is after one of the worst disasters, one of the worst nuclear disasters in this culture's history of nuclear disasters, the land is coming back. And there's one of the things that says to me is that the daily workings of agriculture are even more harmful to the natural world than is one of the worst nuclear disasters in the history of the planet. What gives me hope is that life wants to live, and that the image I keep having is of you have a body that's still alive, but it's been brought in the emergency room, and you have all these doctors are suturing up wounds, and they're trying to stop blood flow out of the body, and they're giving antibiotics, and they're giving oxygen. They're doing everything they can, except that there's a serial killer still standing there stabbing the body, and they're not stopping the actual damage. And another thing that gives me great hope is that there are more than 200, I don't know how many there are at this point, dead zones in the oceans, and only one of them is recovered. And the one that recovered was in the Black Sea. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, industrial scale agriculture became no longer feasible along that part of the coast of the Black Sea. And so they stopped having all the runoff. And within 20 years, the dead zone had recovered enough that they could put in a commercial fishery. Not thrilled about commercial fisheries, but the point is that the fish were back. And I want to be really clear that I'm absolutely not one of those people who says, oh, the world will be fine. You know, we're going to wipe ourselves out. And then after that, the world will be fine. Well, passenger pigeons are not fine. And Eskimo curlews are not fine. And great auks are not fine. And the ocean's not fine. It's like a body. Whenever anybody at one of my talks says, so, you know, we can't, it's really arrogant to think we can kill the planet. We can just, all we're doing is transforming it. When anybody says that to me at one of my talks, I always ask if anybody at the talk has a knife. And then I ask if I can borrow it. And I go into the audience and I ask the person who said, we're not going to kill the planet, we're just going to transform it. I ask them, I'm holding the knife, and I ask them if they'll hold out their hand. And they say, no, of course I'm not going to hold my hand out. And I say, why not? And I'm not really going to do this, of course. But I say, why not? I'm not going to kill you. I can't do that. I'm just going to transform you. I'm just going to cut off some fingers. And then after that, maybe I'll flay your skin a little bit. And then after that, even here's the thing is that even when your heart stops beating, you're not dead because there's a bunch of bacteria in there that'll still survive. And so I don't know what your big deal is. In fact, 90% of the bacteria inside of you, 90% of the cells inside of you don't even have your own DNA. So my point is that what gives me hope is that life really wants to live. But I think it's extraordinarily important to note that that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want any more than it means you can do whatever you want to a body.
Okay.
There is a point beyond which, first off, you're doing harm. Second, there is a point beyond which the body can't recover. It used to be thought that one unit of damage caused 1 unit of harm to some sort of natural community, a lake, a forest, a river. But that is no longer thought to be true at all, that instead, natural communities, which is what a lot of people call ecosystems, natural communities do the same thing that humans do and do the same thing that human families do, which is they try to hold things together and they try to hold things together and they try to hold things together.
Yeah.
And then at some point they can't. So it's basically one unit of damage. 1 unit of damage does not do a unit of harm. It's a step function. It can absorb, and then it's going to be a steep drop off, which we've seen as natural community after natural community has collapsed.
Sure. Derrick, I'm gonna because we've got loads of questions, so I'm gonna just interrupt you there because I wanted to segue from what you were saying about love and everybody loves life and life loves life and so on. So you say life longs for itself or love life loves itself and we love life and all that. So this and you've also said how Chernobyl, as soon as we stopped our intensive farming there in Chernobyl or in that patch in the ocean, then life loves itself and came back. So here's the thing. There's a lot of us, a lot of humans, a lot of Homo sapiens sapiens on the planet. We're taking up a lot of space. and we're exploiting the environment and displacing all the other animals. There's this guy, I think he's a bit on your wavelength. He's William E. Rees, bioecologist from Canada, I think, and he puts this point around the mammalian biomass by weight. 10,000 years ago, before the agrarian revolution, before when we were hunter-gatherers, nomads, and we settled down into farming and domesticating animals, we constituted 1% of the mammalian biomass on the planet. And now, with 7 or 8 billion of us, we constitute about a third of the mammalian biomass. And not only that, our domestic animals, our cattle, our pet dogs, all that constitute about another two-thirds, leaving about 5% of the mammal by weight is the exotic lions and tigers and elephants and so on. How, when we love life, we love human life, how can this in unsustainable civilization get from a point where we are now at one third of the biomass by weight down to some sort of sustainable carrying capacity, which may be 1%, like Bill Rees says was the case before 10,000 years ago, or it might be a few more percent. But whatever the hell it is, it's a huge drop from 7 or 8 billion to a sustainable carrying capacity. So that's the point. And there was a question which I'm going to try and give you two at once. There was a thing in the chat that came up about empowering women, and I mention it because it's got the word population control in it. Why do you think that people are more interested in not having population control than they are in empowering women, which would do the same job? So there you are. You've got a big question about population, which is one of these really toxic subjects in the Green Party as well as elsewhere.
Yeah, someday the population will be much, much lower than it is now, the human population. First, I want to say that the situation is even much worse than you suggested because you were talking about mammalian biomass. But if you measure what some people have called the technosphere, which is everything we've created, that's the weight of all the human highways and dams and computers and cell phones and sofas. If you calculate the entire weight of the technosphere, it is currently about 7 times the weight of the biosphere. And so we are literally, in all physical truth, converting the living planet into stuff. And I go back to what my doctor friend says that the first step toward a correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment. And if you can't talk about, I mean, there are a few things that we are not allowed to talk about in society. Um, and one of them is the, I'm pausing so I can give the organizers a heart attack so that, because they'll think I'm going to talk about something else. Anyway, um, the trans issue.
Talk about
Anyway,
what you want. I don't care. Talk about what you want, Derek.
okay. Anyway, so well, I'll just say it then. There are a few things that we cannot say and we can't talk about in public. And one of them is you can't talk about how women don't have penises. You're not allowed to say that these days. So another thing that we're not allowed to talk about is population. Because as soon as you start talking about human overpopulation, people start calling you all sorts of names. And I want to take a little bit more sophisticated approach to this. That first, there is a tiny bit of truth in some of the names they call us, mainly racist, because when we think about overpopulation, the first thing most of us think about, including myself, is a small child in Mexico City with a distended belly. We think about there simply being too many humans on the planet. But the problem is population times consumption. And we know that, one person in the United States uses many times more resources than that poor child in Mexico City. So the problem is that both sides kind of get it wrong. One side is like population's the only thing. Sometimes Reese is not. Reese totally gets it. William Catton with Overshoot, which is a very important book, uh, got it. But the people on the other side, they go, it's all about resource consumption. And that's not true at all. That's simply true. There's too many humans the planet can support. Um, we need to understand carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the amount of a certain species living a certain way who can live in a place forever. And so you could have an island with a carrying capacity of 100 deer. 100 deer could live there more or less forever. You can exceed carrying capacity, but in doing so, you permanently reduce the carrying capacity. You overshoot. So you could put 1,000 deer on that island, but they're going to eat too much, poop too much, and put their sharp hooves on too much, and they will permanently reduce the carrying capacity of that island, which is what we're seeing on a larger scale. And so it's just, yes, there are too many of us. We are using too much energy. We are stealing too much from the natural world. And I wish we could have intelligent conversations about that. But one of the things that happens, and this is why so many people who talk about overpopulation get unfairly accused of racism. And well, the unfairly is because it's not our fault that Japan and Russia do this. That when countries do gain a negative birth rate, it is considered a disaster. And so Japan, like I said earlier, is considering it a disaster because they're having 2 deaths for every birth. That's the best environmental news ever.
Well, sure,
And
but
nobody's getting killed.
can I press you on the numbers? Because, yes, okay, so Japan might be reducing 2 to 1 or something. How long is it going to take them? Have we got that length of time? What else are we going to do to reduce the numbers which we need to reduce? Because
Well,
these are the questions that we can't answer, I hope, I think.
my point is that even doing this slowly, we're not addressing it correctly because what they're doing in Japan and Russia and some other countries where they're having negative population growth, negative native population growth because they're also having immigration. But anyway, the the stupidity with which we approach it is that what they do there is they say, let's have sex holidays and go home and make more babies. And let's give, I mean, that's the opposite of what we should be doing.
We know that they've got it wrong, but the reduction. What I'm getting at is, even if there was a right way to reduce, how long have we got, and will we get there before the overshoot, kicks us all to like your dead body, you're like your suffering body on the
Absolutely.
on the
Well,
doctor's lap.
honest answer is that we're absolutely not going to do anything about it. And that was the point I was trying to make, is that when a country is going the right way, population wise, they put in policies that will go ahead and push it the wrong direction again. And so we could have, I mean, when you ask a question like, is it too late? I mean, yes, it's too late for passenger pigeons, obviously. It's too late for Eskimo curlews. It's too late for sea mink. It's too late for Steller's sea cows. Name your favorite
Sure,
being or place.
sure, and
But is it too late for salmon? I think give it another 10 years and it will be. And and in terms of population, we can do what we can do, and there are some things we could do. One of the best tools for decreasing overpopulation is teaching little girls how to read. Because if girls have even that amount of self determination, they usually choose to have fewer children and they choose to have them later. And if you're wanting population to go down overnight, that's that's not going to happen in a way that's particularly pleasant to us. And it's interesting. As long as we're doing numbers about population, people talk about, oh my God, COVID's going to depopulate. It's way too slow. The population has not gone down, so the population goes up by, I think, and don't quote me on this number because this is one of those numbers I have a block about. I think it goes up by about 300,000 people per day, and um, even during, for example, the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, population didn't go down, even during that meat grinder. And even during, I don't believe that even during the Spanish flu, uh, did the population actually go down. I believe that the last time the population went down was the Black Death.
Sure.
And so what I think will actually cause population eventually to go down is crop failures from global warming. And we have what do we do about that? I mean, God, so here's the thing. We could do things that could slow population growth now and could start it tailing off. But we're not going to, because in the capitalist countries, they know they need to have X% growth every year or the economy collapses. And you can't do the thing with teaching girls to read because there are some monotheistic sky gods who think women should be subjugated. So, I mean, the short answer is well, here's another thing. 50% of the births right now, human births right now, are either unwanted, actively unwanted, or at the least unplanned. So if you gave women absolute reproductive freedom tomorrow, that would be a huge step toward helping. But is it going to help overnight? Of course not, because humans are
But
not
is it better?
bacteria. Humans aren't mice that live only 3 months or
But
a month or
is
whatever.
it going to help in time? I think that was what I was trying to get to see what your opinion was. Is it going to help in time? Assuming that those things could happen, and it's a big assumption because you've already said the capitalist system wants to, send people home and make more babies or whatever. But even if it could be done in the ideal way that you're saying, whereby fewer babies would be born and nobody would have to be culled or whatever the eugenicists are arguing, then would it happen in time? Would we be able to make that sustainable transition that was the original question?
In time for what?
Well, in time to have a
God's question.
sustainable a society, a world where human beings were reach their carrying capacity that didn't overload the planet and create ecological overshoot. That's the goal. I'm in my
Okay, is it is it theoretically possible? Yes. Will it happen? No.
okay. All right.
Theoretically possible,
Oh,
because but
okay.
there's a study done a few years ago of whether uh, British people 17 to 25 would rather, if they had a choice between losing their cell phone and losing a finger, they would, no, 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 no. That was not even their cell phone. That one, no, that was just cell phone. That's correctly. Uh, about a quarter, about 20% of British people 17 to 25 said that given a choice, they would rather lose their finger than lose their cell phone.
Gosh.
And
What
so
did they
I
say
think we can't really,
yeah.
one of the things I think is really important to talk about is the language of addiction and how we're really addicted to this lifestyle.
Mhm.
And we are addicted to, it's not just addicted, which is, I feel, more mental, emotional, it's also dependent, it's physically dependent. One of the things that's happened, and Daniel Quinn talks about this, is one of the difficulties is that we are dependent for our very lives on the system that's killing the planet. And and my whole point with all this stuff is we can't fix it if we can't even talk about it. So what I want to do is to open the conversation to the fact that we have been made dependent. See, here's the thing is if your food comes from a grocery store and your water comes from a tap, you will defend to the death the system that brings those to you because your life depends on it. And if your food comes from a land base and your water comes from a river, you will defend to the death those because your life depends on it. And one of the things that's happened is that the economic system has systematically inserted itself between us and the source of life. And that's one of the reasons among many that so many of us our primary loyalty is to the system and not to wild nature. That's
Well, can
one reason that,
come in?
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to come in because I think I'd like to move on from the population
Okay.
thing a bit, and there's been a bunch of questions which sort of touch on something you've been talking about. You know, what systems we've got, and there's some questions about sort of green organisations which I'd like you to comment on, green political parties. What historical environmental victories can we learn from? Many grassroots organisations and the resistance that they do. What about Murray Bookchin's ideas? Because he's an anarchist, and he's got a thing called post-scarcity anarchism. Has that any relevance? That kind of organisation approach? And then the last one. So we got positive environmental victories so far. We got what about the post-scarcity anarchism? And the last one on this list is, do you think we need a century two of dictatorial regimes that will fiercely enforce strict laws to ensure global ecological sanity? You've got three prongs of dealing with what kind of organizations. Yeah.
So what is the actual question?
What kind of organizations have worked well? What about post-scarcity anarchism as proposed by Murray Bookchin? And what about dictatorial control to force everybody back down to whatever? I mean, I kind of know that you're going to say we're not in that kind of place yet, but these are the questions that have come out of the chat that I've grouped together, what people are asking in terms of organizational methods forward.
Well, I think one of the important things for us to do in terms of environmental organizations is reclaim environmentalism from those who have co-opted it from being about protecting wild nature to making it about sustaining industrial civilization. When what do all of the mainstream so-called solutions to global warming have in common? What they all have in common is they take industrial capitalism as a given, and the natural world is having to conform to industrial capitalism. Bill McKibben says explicitly that he's trying to save civilization. Same with Lester Brown, Plan B 9.0 to save civilization. They're not talking, and they're quite explicit about this. They're not talking about saving little brown bats. They're not talking about saving wetlands for beavers, and saving beavers for wetlands, really, because beavers are the ones who make the wetlands. Anyway,
what about Murray Bookchin? What about Murray Bookchin? I mean, he's not in the same bracket as Bill McKibben and the people who want to burn wood because it's sustainable and it grows back rather than coal. You know, he's not one of those guys, I don't think. So, what do you think of him and his approach?
I think that Murray Bookchin had some good ideas, and I I was never into Murray Bookchin at all because he's not biocentric. He's not biocentric at all. Um, and for me, that's where environmentalism really needs to return, is to a biocentrism. And I'm pretty stunned by, if you go back and read, for example, the original Wilderness Act in the United States, it is explicit, and they could acknowledge that the problem is civilization. They're trying to save wild nature. And there is this fight that's been going on in environmentalism. It goes all the way back to John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, where John Muir thought nature should be saved for nature's sake, and Gifford Pinchot thought it should be saved for what he called wise use, for basically conserve resources as opposed to protecting wild nature. And the successes that I see have A, come from a biocentrism, have their origin there, and B, well, I want to mention this is, and this is not something all of us can do because they made and then spent tremendous amounts of money, but I just want to give a shout out to um, Doug and Chris Tompkins and Yvonne Chouinard and their whole group, because I think they're three of the most important environmentalists the last 50 years. And what they did is they had a lot of money from Patagonia and uh, and bought land and set it aside. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that there are some good things happening, like some land getting set aside.
Oh, well,
But back to the original point, I think that on one hand we can say that, and on the other, in many ways, the best environmental American president was Richard Nixon, even though he himself was an anti-environmentalist, because he was in so much trouble politically that he was uh, trying to get attention away from Vietnam and Watergate, and so he signed a whole bunch of really good environmental legislation. Um, but the point here is there are a lot of really good small organizations around the world who are acting biocentrically and fighting like hell to preserve this or that scrap of land or this or that creature they love. And I think that that's tremendous work and necessary work. And I think also one of the reasons I became the environmentalist I am is because when I was a baby environmentalist in the late 80s, early 90s, so many of the grassroots activists I knew who were fighting desperately to protect this or that scrap of ground in public, they would say, yeah, we're just trying to protect this or that piece of ground. But in private, they were consistently saying that they were trying to protect this or that piece of ground until civilization collapses. They were just holding on by their fingernails, hoping that these creatures can survive. It's like one environmentalist friend of mine says that as things have become increasingly chaotic, he wants to make sure some doors remain open.
okay.
And what he means by that is if there's still bull trout in 10 years, there may still be bull trout in 100. But if the bull trout are gone in 10, so basically we're all just taking an attitude of not on my watch. And the way that affected me is I was this baby activist and I knew that the longer civilization continues, I knew, again, there was this disjuncture between public and private discourse because in private, they're all saying, God, it's got to come down because it's just killing everything. And then in public, they would say, okay, we want to just protect this particular piece of ground, but they would never talk about the larger issue because they would lose all of their credibility. As soon as you say the whole system is unsustainable, you lose all credibility. So I decided at that point, it's like, well, somebody's got to say it. And of course, other people have been saying it through the millennia, but it's just
There's two
we. I
questions.
wanted to talk about. I wanted if we're not going to if we're killing the planet, we may as well talk about it honestly.
Yeah.
So for me, it all starts about with two things: talking about it honestly, and also having our fierce loyalty not to the system, but to wild nature and to those we love.
So there's two questions, thanks, Derek. There's two questions that have come in that Emma's prompted me about, which are kind of related to that. What are your thoughts on the global rights of nature campaigns and movements? I'm not quite sure what the questioner means, but anyway, maybe you do. The global rights of nature campaigns and movements as a way to help shift and reframe the culture to a healthier way that of seeing ourselves in nature. So that's the thing about the global rights of nature campaigns. And then the other one, which might be a bit similar to what you've just been talking about, is do natives have a right to their land? And if so, does that apply to all natives, or is this a right-wing narrative? Anyway, so yeah, people organizing in that way, global rights of movements, natives, indigenous land, that sort of thing. What do you think? Do you think they got the way forward?
Um, a couple things. What was the first question again?
What are your thoughts on the global rights of nature
Oh yeah.
movement?
Okay.
I don't know if you want to
Um,
just try and explain what they are first, because I don't know which particular ones.
okay, the rights of nature movement is argues that a river has legal rights and a mountain has legal rights. And I I I have two responses to it. Practically, I am fully in support of those and have been on boards of organizations that push those. And I'm delighted to help support within the context of this system, uh, rivers having rights. I mean, it's absurd that corporations have rights and they're just legal fictions. And um, anyway, so sure, within the context of that, I think it's a great thing to do. And it's a great way to keep raising the issue of non-human beingness and non-human sentience. So, yes, I fully support those movements. Second, I know that this would politically be a non-starter, but I'm actually not interested in increasing the rights at the same time as increasing the rights of rivers to not be destroyed. I think we also need to be subtracting rights. I don't think anybody has the right to pollute a river. I don't think anybody has a right to pollute the air. I don't think anybody has a right to deforest. And I think we need to really be thinking hard about attempting to reduce entitlements and rights. We have no entitlement to bomb the moon. We're not entitled to that. We're not entitled to land on the moon. We're not entitled to probe the deepest folds of the ocean. And the problem is that within patriarchy, we males think we get to violate every boundary. Um, and that's what a lot of this is no, nature is not going to set any boundaries because we will boldly go where no man has gone before. We get very, very upset when somebody suggests we have a limit. And I think we need to start putting limits on human behavior, putting enforced limits on human behavior. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's one that's coming. I mean, the second part of it was about what about natives? Whatever the question says, do natives have the right to their land? But I wanted to pick up on. I think you were just saying about they're not going to let this happen. There is a thing that's been in the questions a while already, which I wanted your take on it, and it says there are some people on the left as well as everywhere, as well as elsewhere, on the left, who frame the environmental movement as being a death cult, of glorifying in people dying and in rejection of science like genetic modification and nuclear power. I find this is strange, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, I've noticed this lately, last few years. Greta Thunberg is some sort of Madonna of the death cult, and we're all predicting that the world is going to end. What do you reckon to the way that framing of the environmental movement as a death cult? What's going on there, and what can you do about it?
I think that all we can do, well, honestly, as soon as somebody calls environmentalism death cult, I don't usually talk to them anymore because that's not real. That is rarely argued in good faith. And in terms of you want to see a death cult, look at the dominant culture because it's destroying life on this planet. It's causing 200 species to go extinct every day. It is destroying the capacity of this planet to support life. It kind of cracks me up. I sometimes get accused of being anti-human, but I think that the humans who live 100 years from now, presuming there are any left, I don't think that it's my perspective they're going to be cursing. I think that I'm the one who's actually wanting to leave a world that is better off for humans as well as non-humans. Um, there are so many stories. I know this woman who was married to a guy from Bangladesh, and even in the 1970s, his mother would say, "Go get us some lunch," and he would go to the river and he would fish for lunch, and he would catch fish, and then they would go eat it for lunch. And by the 1980s, the river was so polluted that he couldn't go catch fish for lunch, and now they have to get their fish from Iceland, which is also how we get dependent upon the system, as opposed to real life for us. So recognizing that someday there will be far fewer humans than there are now, and attempting to find non-draconian, non-painful ways to slowly reduce the human population is not does not qualify for being in a death cult. And the problem is that people collectively, their identification is more with civilization than it is with life itself. And with human life, they're identified more with the machines than they are with their own bodies. And so when I say civilization can't last forever, what they're saying is the only way of life that matters has ever mattered in the universe. In fact, my life is not sustainable because they identify with the system, not with wild nature. And so for them, it does feel like death because it's the death of their identification with the system itself, which I think is one of the things that needs to happen. Is we need to break our identification with the system and realign it with wild nature. And this is one reason I joined the Greens back in, or whatever their predecessor was, back in 1989. Is, I thought green, environmental. That's, if there's going to be a biocentric party, I would join it. And uh, it has strayed far from that path. And I don't even know if it was ever on the path. Maybe I just was so desperate for any party that would uh, at least remotely care about wild nature that I, like so many of us when we enter relationships, ignored the danger signs. I don't know. Or maybe it's changed. I don't know the answer to that. But the point is that we need to we need to make Earth first. We need to go back to that. And this is going to get more people to hate me, but the question about natives is part of the problem is that so I've known people who wanted to give land back, like personally give land back to various tribes. And the tribal government said, that's great, we will take the land. But once we get it, you have no control over what we do with it. And if we want to build a gas station there, we're going to build a gas station there. And it's not necessarily that it's going to be protected. And the point is that industrialism and capitalism. So I got in a big argument with a friend of mine many years ago, George Draffin. I'd mentioned him before. This is also 1990. He was telling me that in the beaver trade, in the fur beaver trade, or beaver trade for furs back in the 18th and 19th centuries, Indians actually killed more beavers than white people did. And I said, "My God, George, that's racist." I was anticipating SJWism. And he said, "Derrick, history isn't racist. They're just facts. And if you don't like them, that's fine." And what this really tells us is that there is a relationship between technology and spirituality and technology and your connection with the natural world. What this tells us is that, I mean, it makes perfect sense. If you have a choice between killing a beaver, even though they're sacred to your people, and using that beaver pelt to buy a metal pot that's going to be durable, useful, light, or making a pot through this tradition that has lasted for a long time. But it's a heavy clay pot. It's heavier. It may drop. It's not as convenient. And what about knives? You want to buy a knife, or you want to make one? The logic of capitalism is so seductive, and I mean seductive in its real sense, that edukara, education, comes from the edukara, which means to lead forth or draw out. Seduce comes from the root meaning from the root sedukara, which means to lead astray. And the technologies seduce us; they lead us astray. And so, no, it doesn't matter what your race is, it doesn't matter what your, I should say, the proper word, race is not the proper word. The word is ancestry. It doesn't matter what your genetic ancestry is. What happens is when you introduce capitalism and when you introduce modern technology, it changes your relationship with the land around where you live. And we need to understand that. So that's not a panacea because they're still involved in the capitalist system and they still are involved in the global economy. And that's another thing is that the salmon, I'm not blaming the salmon is a total white problem. The death of the salmon is a total white problem. But the canneries came in before the dams. I always blame the dams in my talks, but the canneries were here first on the Columbia, and uh, the salmon couldn't handle that even before the dams. Because no, this the point of reason I'm bringing all this up is because no no wild creature at all can survive global demand. And so I don't care what I don't it however long you have been on a piece of land and whatever spiritual values your ancestors had, if you are taking some creature from that land to sell to the Chinese or the American market, that's not going to be sustainable. That's different than taking it for your own use. If you're taking it as part of the larger system, then the demand will destroy whatever wild nature wherever you live. Doesn't matter who you are. And somebody has to speak up for wild nature.
Derek, we've got roughly 10 minutes left, and I'm going to ask Emma if there's any other questions that Emma reckons I should put to you in a bit. And I'm going to take one here, which is a slightly different thing that we haven't talked about yet at all, which is to do with young people and education. I mean, you mentioned seduction and education and the etymology there. What is the best thing that we should be teaching our children? Should we take them all out of school? And Emma, but by the way, can you flag us up, Emma, if you've got any other questions in about 5 minutes, just in case we get time for one more?
I can, but I would just like to add to that question. There was a second part to that question about what do we do about children and education, and that was how do we, if we think that that's a good way to go, how do we make sure that it doesn't land up all on women to kind of be responsible for most of that, as women tend to be responsible for childcare as it is. And if we take children out of those institutions that we have, who's going to look after them?
So I think that one of the reasons I became an environmentalist is because I am fundamentally conservative, by which I don't mean socially conservative. Everybody's having a heart attack. What I mean is that I think it's a really stupid idea. Okay, salmon exist for their own sake and for the forest's sake and for the sake of bears and for the sake of future generations of salmon. But I also think it's really stupid to destroy some animal or plant that you may need to eat in the future. I just think it's fundamentally stupid to do open air experiments. Hey, let's change the climate and see what happens. Hey, let's bathe the world in endocrine disruptors and see what happens. I think open air experiments are stupid. So this is a surprise. A lot of times when young people ask me, should I stay in college? Should I get a high school education? You know, the society's gonna collapse. What use is that going to be? And I always tell them, uh, you need to have the tools to survive within the system as well in case the system doesn't collapse. So far as education, I think kids need to be outside a lot. They need to be running around, climbing trees, falling out of them, breaking their arms, the things that children do. Hopefully don't break your arm, but sprain your ankle, well, anyway, need to be outside a lot. And they need to be taught to respect wild nature and to love and just taught the awe of being out there and taught to interact with wild animals and to not be a sadist, not to stomp on every bug you see, but to look at the bug and to recognize the otherness in it. And That's important. I also think reading, writing, and arithmetic is important as long as the system lasts. I think that I, for two things. One of them is that it's, uh, those are useful tools to have and better to have tools than not. That's why I said the conservative thing. And the other is when I was a junior in college, I told my mom I wanted to quit. And she said a really smart thing because I wasn't enjoying physics. And my mom said a really smart thing, which is, would you rather go the rest of your life saying you have a degree in physics, or would you rather go the rest of your life saying you have 3 years toward a degree in physics? Like, yeah, that's a good idea. Because when I got out, I never worked in physics, but after college, but I I became a writer and a beekeeper, and I could be so courageous because I had a safety net that at any time I could have quit and gotten a job in physics. And so I believe in safety nets. I believe in having, uh, I believe in taking great risks once you have made sure that your belay rope is safe. So for education, I believe that stick with it, even though I'm not saying stick with public school necessarily, but to have a good classical education, of reading, writing, arithmetic, know the basics of history, know the basics of literature. Um, I mean, as long as I'm making it so somebody else has to do the work, go ahead and learn a couple, three languages too. Um, Even though all I can say from German is Erica at home? Yes, she's upstairs. Um, anyway, so education. I think the thing to add is to be outside and to convey. And then so far as who does it, this is a really hard thing because at one point, yeah, I mean, it's great that women are. It's absurd that women were ever prohibited from being doctors, engineers, etc. And it's great that women are entering those fields. The hesitation I have on all this is that women being in the labor market, great, great, great. The problem is that declining is that victory was allowed because it also served the economic system because no longer can one income support a family as happened in the 1950s and 60s in at least some cases. So I don't know. I don't have children and I don't know how anybody could be raising three children and educating them themselves and paying rent and sleeping. I don't, I have tremendous respect for the people. So I don't know how to answer your question of how do we, it, since public schools are failing so much on so many levels, how do we not push that simply onto the women at home? I fully recognize the importance of that question, and I don't have an answer. Well, I do have an answer.
I can put another one for you.
Tell the men to get off their butts and work and do it too.
Oh,
Okay.
that's interesting because one of the other questions that, because we're going to just say we've had loads of questions that we haven't had time to ask. So if you asked a question, I'm sorry that we haven't had time to put it to Derek, but one of the other
We'll do it
questions,
again sometime.
yeah, one of the other questions was, is it men's fault? And I have a issue with that, but and it's a very simplistic question, but you say we should get the men to get off their butts and look after the kids.
Is it okay? What was the question precisely? Is it men's fault or is it men's problem? Which did you say?
Is it men's fault?
I do think that um, the problem comes, it's not men's fault, it's patriarchy's fault. I can go with that, that it is this fundamental belief. No, no, if I'm going to blame anybody, I'm going to blame Plato, Aristotle. I'll blame all of them. Um, if I'm going to blame anything, I'm going to blame the great chain of being. The great chain of being is a notion that that God is at the top, completely disembodied, followed by angels, followed by humans who are a battleground of mind and body, followed by animals, then plants, then soil, each one more embodied and more corrupt and less mind. And that notion suffuses everything. Like when you think of a great piece of art, Mona Lisa, um, uh, something by Van Gogh, uh, um, Sistine Chapel. Um, that's a dog coughing. Um, why don't you think of birdsong, uh, sunrise? Because nature doesn't make art according to the great chain of being. And because the great chain of being, it only comes from disembodied mind. Body doesn't make art, which is completely contrary to my experience. And also, it's that notion what we create, what we think is more important than what is physical. That's the great chain of being causing problems. And that then leads to it being men's fault because women and nature create through their bodies. I'm not saying women can't think big things because, of course, they can, but men don't create babies with their bodies. And that's great if men would just go, wow, I have a different role in life than gestating a baby. I have other things I can do. But instead, 6,000, 10,000 years ago, men got jealous and was like, well, they create life. Oh, Richard Drinan, who wrote Facing West, Metaphysics of Empire Building and Indian Hating, wrote, he said this great line, if woman can create life and I can destroy it, who is the more powerful? And I think that's the essence of patriarchy. And that's also the essence. Unfortunately, I know we got to go, but we get really excited when scientists get really excited when they create some life in a lab. We made enzymes and we're so close to making life. Wow, just think when we can create life. It's like, dude, mice and bunnies create life every single day. And when they do it, you don't consider it a miracle. And that's that's how it's men's fault is that we think we got to overcompensate for the fact that well, if the body can create something, I can do something better. And that leads to a lot of our contempt for nature.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a great note to end on. And I want to say, Derrick, it's been amazing to have you here. Yeah, thanks ever so much for being here. Thanks to everybody who's come along. I don't think I really need to say anything else.
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks, Derrick, and thank you to all the audience who came. Thank you for coming along. Good night.
Thanks for having me.